Have you ever celebrated June 21? While many know it as the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, it's also National Aboriginal Day, a time to recognize and celebrate the diverse cultures and contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. In some parts of Canada, like the Northwest Territories, it's even a paid holiday. Across the country, you might find celebrations with drumming, dancing, moose stew, and fry bread. But for many Canadians, the day passes by unnoticed. This raises a question. How much do we actually know about the First Peoples of Canada? Scientific evidence tells us that Indigenous peoples have lived on this land for over 12,000 years. But Indigenous oral histories go back even further, to time immemorial, and describe the land as Turtle Island, a term still widely used today. Non-Indigenous Canadians owe much to the ongoing land stewardship of Indigenous communities who have cared for and protected the natural environment for generations. Even the word Canada is believed by some to be rooted in the Cree language, with one interpretation being Kakanata Aski, meaning the land that is clean. But the shared history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada is far from peaceful. Since the time of first contact with Europeans, relationships have been shaped by misunderstandings, imbalances of power, and ongoing conflict. Indigenous communities have had to navigate imposed systems and values that often worked against their own, while also striving to maintain cultural continuity and community peace. This chapter will explore the complex relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, looking at the past, acknowledging the present, and considering the possibilities for the future. It's a relationship that continues to evolve, and one that requires awareness, respect, and an honest understanding of the history that shaped it. Words matter, especially when we're speaking about Indigenous peoples in Canada. The terms we use, whether it's First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, carry weight. Some terms, like status Indian or non-status Indian, come from the Indian Act, not from Indigenous communities themselves. That history of being labeled by others makes it even more important to be thoughtful and respectful with the language we use. Language isn't just about vocabulary, it's about identity. There are more than 60 Indigenous languages spoken across Canada today, grouped into 12 distinct language families. These languages aren't only a means of communication, they're also a way of preserving stories, relationships with the land, and cultural values. For many Indigenous communities, storytelling is central to education and the transmission of knowledge. While you may have grown up with bedtime stories or fairy tales, Indigenous children grow up hearing creation stories and oral histories that carry spiritual, historical, and moral teachings. These stories help shape identity and community memory, often passed from one generation to the next through spoken word, songs, and ceremonies. Tools like the medicine wheel represent this worldview. It's not just a symbol, it reflects a holistic perspective, showing how everything in life is interconnected. The directions, the elements of human nature, the seasons, and the sacred medicines. Another important cultural symbol is the totem pole, especially on the Northwest Coast. These carved poles document family histories, legends, and values. Every figure, color, and animal has meaning and tells a specific story. The importance of storytelling is also recognized legally. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court of Canada accepted oral histories as valid legal evidence in cases about land rights. This was a major step in validating Indigenous knowledge systems, which often don't rely on written records, but are no less accurate or significant. Despite these advances, Indigenous communities continue to fight for the right to preserve and express their culture. Early government policies aimed to assimilate Indigenous peoples into settler society, often under the assumption that their ways of life were inferior. But these communities have resisted, maintained their languages, and asserted their rights, reminding us that Canada's identity is deeply tied to the identities of its first peoples. So, when we ask ourselves what kind of Canada we want to live in, we also have to ask, are we truly acknowledging and including the people who were here first? Are we listening to their stories, respecting their ways of knowing, and making space for their voices? Treaties are a central part of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers in what is now Canada. They were meant to create peaceful coexistence with agreements grounded in mutual respect. But from the very beginning, there were deep misunderstandings, mostly around land, sovereignty, and the intentions behind these agreements. Indigenous peoples had lived on Turtle Island for thousands of years and saw themselves as part of the land with a responsibility to act as stewards, not owners. When Europeans arrived, they were considered visitors, welcomed, but also expected to respect the values and responsibilities that came with being on the land. One of the earliest and most symbolic agreements was the two-row wampum, a belt made of white and purple beads representing two vessels traveling side by side down the river of life, one indigenous, one European. Each was to follow its own path without interfering with the other, emphasizing equality and autonomy. This belt remains a powerful symbol of indigenous sovereignty. Eventually, these early ideals gave way to colonial policies. With the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Crown formally recognized indigenous land title and created a process requiring treaties to acquire land. It acknowledged that indigenous peoples were nations with whom agreements had to be made. This remains legally binding under Canada's Constitution today. As Canada expanded, three major treaty eras developed: pre-Confederation treaties, the numbered treaties from 1871 to 1921, and modern land claims. The numbered treaties, covering vast territories in the prairies and the north, were driven by Canada's desire to access land for railroads, agriculture, and settlement. In exchange, Indigenous communities were promised reserve lands, hunting and fishing rights, medical care, education, and annual payments. However, the treaty process was often flawed. There were major language and cultural gaps, and many agreements were made based on oral promises that never made it into the written treaties. Treaty documents were often prepared in advance, and some Indigenous signatories couldn't read or write. The result was that many communities believed they were entering into partnerships, only to find out later that their rights and identities were severely undermined. Some communities were excluded entirely, either because the government didn't know they were there or because they chose not to participate. And many of the promised supports, such as healthcare or education, were never fully delivered. The history of treaties in Canada reflects both hope for cooperation and real experiences of betrayal. While Indigenous negotiators often came in good faith, expecting meaningful relationships and mutual benefit, the outcomes rarely lived up to those expectations. Even today, many treaty rights are still being fought for and clarified. So the key question remains: when Indigenous peoples signed these agreements, did they know they were not just exchanging land, but potentially their right to self-determination and identity? That's the legacy we're still trying to understand and address. Land claims in Canada are about much more than territory. They're about rights, recognition, and reconciliation. The issues surrounding Indigenous land rights remain complex and unresolved in many parts of the country, and different types of claims reflect the different ways those rights have been challenged or denied. There are two main categories of land claims. Comprehensive claims are modern-day treaties. These occur in areas where Indigenous land rights were never addressed by earlier treaties or laws. These claims are about defining how traditional lands and resources can be used today. They often take decades to settle, on average about 15 years, and involve large territories and many stakeholders. Specific claims deal with past wrongs, such as when treaty terms weren't fulfilled or money was mismanaged. These are faster to process and are typically related to failed obligations under existing treaties. For example, in 2010, a First Nations community received a settlement after being shortchanged on land promised under an 1899 treaty. Despite attempts to streamline the process, such as setting timelines for resolving specific claims, many claims still get stuck in long assessments or litigation. There's also a lot of misunderstanding about how land claims and self-government relate. Though often negotiated at the same time, self-government is a separate process. Canada formally recognizes Indigenous communities' right to self-government, but many Indigenous leaders argue that this still falls short of full self-determination, as defined in international agreements like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These issues are not just legal. They're deeply emotional and political. When governments fail to act, conflict can erupt. One powerful example is the confrontation at Camp Ipperwash, where unarmed protester Dudley George was shot during a peaceful land occupation in 1995. His community had been promised the return of their land after World War II, but decades passed without action. An inquiry later found fault with both the police and government officials. Another example is the Oka Crisis of 1990, when a Mohawk community resisted a golf course expansion onto sacred land. A barricade, a police raid, and a 78-day standoff followed. While some progress has been made since, such as funding for youth centers and police stations, the land at the center of the conflict still hasn't been formally transferred to the community. What these examples show is that land claims are not only about historical injustice, they're about ongoing relationships and commitments. Many Indigenous communities continue to wait, advocate, and fight for what was promised. Until land, rights, and governance are addressed with fairness and respect, these tensions are likely to persist. Before 1850, most interactions between Indigenous peoples and colonial officials were centered around land. But land control wasn't the only goal. Beneath the surface, there was a growing effort to assimilate Indigenous peoples into settler society. To do that, the government first needed a way to define who qualified as Indian. Two key acts were passed in 1850 to establish this legal identity and to assign control over leasing and managing Indigenous land to a central commission. These acts marked the beginning of a system that would tie identity, rights, and land access together through law. The initial legal definition of Indian was broad. It included people by blood, marriage, adoption, and residence within an Indigenous community. But these definitions weren't meant to reflect cultural understanding. They were bureaucratic tools to manage who was eligible for protection and who wasn't. This classification system was tied to assimilation policies. In 1857, the Gradual Civilization Act introduced the idea of enfranchisement, encouraging Indigenous men to give up their legal status in exchange for voting rights and other privileges. But the requirements were so strict that almost no one applied. Later amendments extended government control even further and introduced band councils, a system of governance still in use today, but one imposed rather than chosen. These laws were also deeply discriminatory, especially against Indigenous women. If a woman married someone without status, whether Indigenous or not, she and her children lost their status. Men did not face the same consequence. These rules had long-lasting effects on identity, belonging, and access to rights. Altogether, these early laws laid the groundwork for what would become the Indian Act of 1876, a single piece of legislation that would centralize control and further entrench a colonial system of defining, managing, and often erasing Indigenous identities. The Indian Act of 1876 remains one of the most significant and controversial pieces of legislation in Canadian history. Its purpose was to consolidate previous laws into one act to manage and control Indigenous peoples and their lands. But it went far beyond administration. It created a system designed to assimilate and suppress. Under this act, all Indigenous peoples were grouped together and treated as wards of the state, not as citizens or sovereign nations, but as dependents of the federal government. It created a parent-like relationship where the government made decisions on behalf of Indigenous communities without their full input or consent. The Act formalized a legal identity system through the Indian Register, categorizing individuals into status Indians, recognized under the Act and entitled to specific legal rights; non-status Indians, who identified as Indigenous but were not legally recognized, often because their status had been revoked or not properly recorded; treaty Indians, those from bands that signed specific treaties with the Crown. These categories were discriminatory and exclusionary, reducing Indigenous identity to bureaucratic definitions. The Act didn't recognize Inuit or Métis peoples at all, further deepening their marginalization. The legislation introduced widespread restrictions on Indigenous life. These included denying the right to vote unless status was renounced until 1960, banning cultural ceremonies like potlatches and sun dances, outlawing traditional clothing in public without permission, forcing children into residential schools, prohibiting Indigenous legal action on land claims using community funds, stripping status from Indigenous women who married non-status men, while allowing the opposite for non-Indigenous women. Although some of these practices have been repealed or amended, the damage was done. Generations of Indigenous people were forcibly disconnected from their cultures, communities, and legal rights. The Indian Act is not just a relic of the past. It continues to shape government-Indigenous relations, and while efforts have been made to reform it, its legacy remains one of control, exclusion, and cultural erasure. Residential schools were one of the most devastating tools used by the Canadian government to enforce assimilation. The idea was to civilize Indigenous children by removing them from their families, communities, and cultures during their most impressionable years. Starting in the 1880s, these schools were built across Canada and were operated by various Christian churches. The goal wasn't education in the way we think of it today. It was about cultural erasure. In 1920, the Indian Act made it mandatory for Indigenous children to attend these schools and illegal for them to go anywhere else. Children had to stay until age 18, but were only taught up to about grade 8 if they were taught academics at all. Instead, most of the day was spent in religious training and manual labor. Boys were trained in trades like farming and shoemaking, while girls learned domestic skills such as sewing and baking. These limited lessons were designed to prepare them for roles as laborers or servants, not for further education or leadership. The schools were brutal. Children were forbidden to speak their languages, wear traditional clothing, or celebrate their cultures. Siblings were often kept apart, hair was cut, food was unfamiliar, and punishment was common for any expression of identity. The school structure was designed to sever cultural and family ties. Beyond this cultural violence, many children suffered physical and sexual abuse. These experiences left deep psychological scars and contributed to the breakdown of parenting knowledge and family systems. Many survivors left the schools feeling disconnected, traumatized, and uncertain of their identity or place in the world. Residential schools have had intergenerational effects. They created cycles of trauma that continue to affect Indigenous families and communities today. The system was not about education. It was about control, suppression, and cultural genocide. The long-term damage is a part of Canada's history that must be acknowledged and understood to support healing and reconciliation. The last residential school closed in 1996, but the government had already started phasing them out in the late 1950s, continuing into the 1980s. The thinking at the time was that Indigenous children would be better off in the child welfare system and public schools, where they were believed to receive better education and care. But this shift didn't break from the assimilation mindset. It just changed form. What we now call the 60s scoop involved thousands of Indigenous children being taken from their homes, often without consent, and placed with non-Indigenous families. Between 1960 and 1990, more than 11,000 adoptions were officially recorded, though the real number may be closer to 20,000. About 70% of those children were adopted into non-Indigenous homes, and many are now trying to reconnect with their birth families. In 2017, a major Ontario court case ruled that the federal government had failed to protect the identities of those taken children. Instead of appealing, the government agreed to begin negotiations to address the harm done. Back in 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper formally apologized for the residential school system, calling it a sad chapter in Canadian history. That same day, another political leader spoke of assuming responsibility and building a shared future. But it raises an important question. Did those apologies make a difference? Comedian Ryan McMahon shared that his grandmother, a survivor, had told him stories of both abuse and small positives from her time in residential school. She passed away before the apology. Years later, McMahon questioned its impact, asking why Indigenous people are constantly told to move on. especially when Canada insists on remembering other national traumas like war. To ensure this history isn't forgotten, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created in 2008 as part of a legal settlement. The TRC had 5 years and $60 million to investigate the legacy of residential schools. In 2015, they released a final report detailing systemic abuse, more than 3,000 recorded student deaths, and disturbing practices like the use of a homemade electric chair. This wasn't just a flawed education system. It was a national tragedy that demands acknowledgement and action. In 1969, the Canadian government attempted a major shift in Indigenous policy with the release of the White Paper, a proposal that aimed to eliminate the Indian Act and remove legal distinctions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. The idea was to promote equality by ending special status, but to Indigenous communities, this proposal was seen as erasing their rights, identities, and treaties. If implemented, the White Paper would have dismantled treaty protections, transferred federal responsibility to the provinces, and terminated legal recognition of Indigenous peoples altogether. While it was framed as promoting inclusion, Indigenous leaders saw it as a policy of forced assimilation. The response was swift and strong. Indigenous voices across Canada united in opposition, and by 1971, the government was forced to withdraw the proposal. Later, in 1985, the government passed Bill C-31 to amend the Indian Act. One of its main goals was to correct gender discrimination that had stripped status from Indigenous women who married non-status men. Bill C-31 reinstated status to over 127,000 people and allowed bands to control their own membership lists. This was a small but important move towards self-determination. That theme of self-government became central to the work of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, which was launched in 1991 in response to ongoing tensions, including the Oka crisis. The Commission spent 5 years gathering input and released a massive report in 1996 with 440 recommendations. These included calls for a restructured Indian Act, recognition of Indigenous self-government, dual citizenship as Indigenous nationals and Canadian citizens, creation of an Indigenous Parliament and a national bank, greater economic control through land and resources. Despite its scope and promise, progress on the RCAP's recommendations has been slow and uneven. Many of the key ideas remain unfulfilled. A decade after its release, Indigenous leaders pointed out the lack of meaningful change in areas like housing, healthcare, education, and legal recognition. The White Paper, Bill C-31, and the RCAP together highlight a long struggle between imposed solutions and Indigenous-led governance. While some steps have been taken, much work remains in achieving true reconciliation and self-determination. Despite repeated inquiries and policy reviews, conditions for Indigenous peoples in Canada continue to change only slowly. One of the most urgent and heartbreaking issues is the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIW. Between 1980 and 2014, at least 1,181 Indigenous women and girls were reported missing or murdered in Canada. Many believe the real number is far higher. For years, calls for a national inquiry were ignored, even as the United Nations urged action. It wasn't until 2016 that a full national inquiry was finally launched under the federal government, with provincial support and a budget of nearly $54 million. The inquiry sought to uncover the systemic causes of this violence, factors like racism, poverty, lack of police response, and the legacy of colonialism. It also reflected a broader issue, that despite promises of change, the RCAP recommendations and other calls to action often go unfulfilled. Another related concern is what's been referred to as the Millennium Scoop. Today, there are more Indigenous children in state care than were in residential schools at the height of their operation. In 1953, residential schools housed 11,000 children. Today, over 30,000 Indigenous children are in care across the country, about 15% of all children in care, even though Indigenous children make up only about 3% of the national population. This reflects an ongoing pattern. Indigenous families continue to be over-surveilled and separated. with little attention paid to the underlying issues like poverty, housing, and access to services. The legacy of the Indian Act and the assumptions behind it still shapes how policies are made and how Indigenous peoples are treated. The fight for justice and equity for Indigenous women, children, and families is not only about addressing individual tragedies, it's about challenging the systems and attitudes that make those tragedies possible and demanding the kind of structural change that was called for decades ago, but still hasn't been delivered. As we conclude, we shift our focus to current realities and ongoing issues facing Indigenous peoples in Canada. While progress has been made in some areas, many challenges remain, reflecting the lasting impact of colonial policies and systemic inequality. Economic growth among Indigenous communities has been notable. From 2001 to 2011, Indigenous income more than doubled from $6.9 billion to $14.2 billion, with projections estimating it could reach $32 billion by 2016. Much of this growth is tied to increased participation in natural resource development, construction, and business ventures. However, we must ask, who benefits from this development and at what cost? Movements like Idle No More emerged to voice concerns over proposed legislation, such as Bill C-45, which threatened to erode environmental protections and Indigenous rights. This grassroots mobilization showed the power of collective action and social media in raising awareness and building momentum for change. It highlighted the deep connection Indigenous communities have to the land and their desire to be stewards of their traditional territories. But Indigenous perspectives on development are not uniform. While some communities oppose extractive industries due to environmental concerns, others actively pursue resource-based projects as pathways to self-sufficiency. Initiatives like the Eagle Spirit Pipeline show how some Indigenous groups are taking ownership of development on their own terms, negotiating for equity and control. Despite these efforts, the social conditions facing Indigenous peoples remain deeply concerning. Half of status First Nations children live below the poverty line. This is not just a statistic, it reflects a persistent systemic crisis. Suicide rates, particularly among youth and in Inuit communities, are alarmingly high. Life expectancy is significantly lower than the national average. Educational attainment and employment rates lag, while incarceration rates are disproportionately high. All of these realities point to a troubling conclusion. Systemic discrimination continues to affect the daily lives and opportunities of Indigenous peoples. While we can recognize economic gains or isolated policy reforms, the broader structures of inequality have not yet been dismantled. And so we are left with a pressing question. What will it take to bring about real, lasting change? How do we move from awareness to action, from apology to accountability? These questions must be at the center of our collective efforts moving forward.